Aloha mai kako. Welcome to the American Association of Geographers webinar series. That is a prelude to the upcoming conference that will be held here in Honolulu in April. We're getting close to the conference date, so excitement is building for this conference, and we've been pleased to help that process of preparing people for what to expect when they come here to Hawaii by hosting this webinar series. We've had six great webinars so far. I hope you'll check them out online at the conference website. And we have one more today called Pono Science. Pono Science as applicable to in any community, not just Hawaii. Importance of positionality in research, intention, creating space for other ways of knowing, epistemology, decolonizing research, and movements. And we have to lead our seminar, our webinar, Noelani Puniwai, Associate Professor at Kamakakūokalani Center for Hawaiian Studies at the University of Hawaii at Mānoa. Aloha, Noelani. Thank you for preparing this webinar and guiding us through the day. You can come off mute. There you go. So tell us about you. What's your background? How'd you get interested? How'd you get to your position at the University of Hawaii, and how'd you get interested in this topic?
Oh, thanks. I think I'll go into a little bit in my talk, but as a background, I am born and raised in Puna, on Hawaii Island, kind of that little seascape landscape you see behind me. And I know that it has done an amazing job of shaping who I am today. So I really got into marine science at a young age. And I followed that career for many, many years through college and through all the projects that I worked on. And just knowing, however, that my purpose was always to make sure Hawaii stayed Hawaii. Like, how do I make sure these landscapes and these seascapes stay healthy or become more thriving and abundant? And that's why I got into science. Yet I didn't end up in science. Right now, as you said, I teach in the Hawaiian Studies department at UH Mānoa. And I think that is the perfect space for me because I work with people who have the same love and appreciation for Hawaii as I do, and are just finding the tools and the different methods and the different ways that we can all try and make sure Hawaii stays Hawaii.
Well, in fact, as we start to unlock the data and all the analysis in chants and in our mo'olelo, the stories that our ancestors have left behind, we find they were actually great scientists. And there's really no separation between being in cultural studies and being scientific studies. It's the very same thing. And I'm sure you're going to get into that today. So we're going to turn it over to you shortly, but we'll and I understand you have about an hour's worth of content, and we invite our webinar participants to put questions into the chat, and we'll do our best to make sure that you come out of this webinar fulfilled in terms of having all the questions answered that you may have or maybe stimulated by Noelani's presentation. So with that, Noelani, and we'll do that about 15 minutes at the end, depending upon how many questions we see in the chat. But at this point, we'll turn it over to you, and we'll kind of go off screen and let you share your screen and introduce your content.
Great, thanks. Thanks for setting us up for today. Yeah, and whoever has questions throughout the webinar, feel free to pose it at any time in the Q&A, or you can wait to the end as well. But if it's pertinent to what I'm talking about, feel free to just go ahead and let me know what you're thinking. I would love for this to be as much of a dialogue as you're open to. Okay. So what I prepared today is just a little snapshot of kind of what I've been thinking about regarding Pono Science. As Neil and I were talking about earlier, I'm definitely trained in the sciences. And now as I work in the current position I have, this is something that is of huge interest to me and also the students that I serve. So I have been a faculty at the University of Hawaii at Mānoa for about 7 years now. And I was raised on Hawaii Island, and that's where I live currently as well with my 3 children who are here with me. And so what I'm going to kind of share with you today is a little story, not just about myself, but about the journey of learning and the journey of doing science and the journey of doing research that we've all been on, right? If you are part of the Association of American Geographers conference, that means you're in academia or somehow interested in research, and not just about how we live in places, but the roles that we do and the roles that we play in our science. And that's what I want to talk a little bit about today. I have here in the corner a little QR code that goes to that website, hilo.hawaii.edu vehe. and it's the Hawaiian Language Dictionary. And I want to encourage you, as you listen to the webinar, or also as you're in Hawaii, to use the dictionary to get more familiar and comfortable with the Hawaiian language. It is the language of this island. It's a little bit about what I'll talk about today, the importance of language and how language shapes your worldview, right? So the more comfortable we get with the Hawaiian language, the more comfortable we can get with Hawaii, the more we can learn about Hawaii and hear Hawaii's story. So I will be using Hawaiian words throughout, and I will probably forget to define them since it is a part of like my normal vocabulary. So I encourage you to go and check it out and start learning a new language. Okay, so we're going to kick it off talking about epistemology. I am not a philosopher. I have never been a philosopher, but as I've come to understand what a Hawaiian worldview is, how do we understand the data, the science, the research that my ancestors did, I started learning about how their way of knowing is so different than the one I learned in school, right? The way I was trained as an academic scientist, in my natural resources programs, just the languages we used, how different those things was. And in the beginning, those were just two worlds for me, right? I was raised on Hawaii Island. I danced hula from an early age with hala'o kekuhi up until recently. I paddled canoe. I lived on the ocean. I did these things separately in my world. And I didn't understand how much those things influenced my research. And so we're going to just talk about how epistemology defines knowledge, right? And what can be known. And that's really the differences when we talk about our different cultures, our different ways of knowing. I love this quote from Dr. Manu Aluli Meyer. And Auntie Manu has written a lot about Hawaiian epistemology and the way Hawaiians know and how they know through their bodies. That is how knowledge is created, in the doing, in the practice, in the observing, in the millennia of observations that bring us till today. And in her quote, how I experience the world is different from how you experience the world, and both our interpretations matter. What she's really trying to share is just how much your epistemology is created, not just by your cultural viewpoints, but the space that you're in, right? All these different things make up who you are. I have 3 sisters. We're all completely different from each other. We were raised in the same family, in the same locations, in the same aina, yet the way we shape the world around us is really different, right? Because we each have had different experiences, even though we're raised in the same place. This really became apparent to me when I was working on my PhD. I was working in the Natural Resources and Environmental Management program at the University of Hawaiʻi Mānoa, and I was interested in studying ocean currents. And I come from like a coastal resource management background. I love marine ecology, I love science, but I want it to be applied. I'm doing science to make sure Hawaii is more healthy in the future. And so I'm looking at all the data. I had a job where I was trying to gather all the marine science data that entered in Hawaii. It's kind of the picture in the top right corner there, and model the areas that needed more attention, or model the areas that were pristine-ish and that we wanted to protect further. And as I was gathering all this data that had been collected over the last couple decades in Hawaii, I realized we didn't have much written down. Yet I knew that knowledge existed out there. I knew that all the information that I needed to understand our ocean environments were in the people who are out there every day, which aren't the scientists, right? They're not the ones trying to code it and simplify it. They're the ones that live it through their complex experiences. And so, uncles that I have pictured here have shared so much different wisdom with me about how they understand the ocean. And I'll never be able to understand 10% of what they tried to share with me because I didn't have the same experiences as them. Uncle Mitch was a fisherman from Miloli'i his entire life. He knew fishing. He knew the waters. He knew the currents. He knew the species. He created a beautiful life for all of his keiki and his grandkids. And I try to ask him about the currents off of Hilo, off of South Point, off of Puna coastlines. And he'd just laugh and he would tell me stories. And he said, so I asked him a question. Okay, Uncle, can you tell me about how the currents move outside Pohoiki? That's one of the boat ramps that he would launch off of. And then he spent 15 minutes telling me a story about a whale shark. And I was like, a super cool story, but I don't get it, right? And that's when I understood he is picturing his mind. His body has experienced the currents of pohoiki, and he's trying to communicate it to me with a story, a lived story of his interactions in those spaces, where he launched from, what time, what season, he went this direction, he did this interaction happened. All of these things, the variables that he's modeling in his head, right? And so the paper that I wrote off of that was just based on the fact that experts is the hardest sort of people to communicate with, right? Because their level of understanding is so much higher than me that I'm not able to model what he knows. And that is what I think is really important to understand about traditional knowledge, about indigenous knowledge, is the complexity and the relationships and the stories that are behind it are all part of that experience, right? And it's not something that you can separate and then put into a model. The Kane, the guy on the right side, looking out at the ocean, he's looking out. There's a canoe race going on out there, and he's looking at the currents, he's looking at the wind sow, he's looking at the speed of everything. And I'm looking at the same ocean as him, yet I will never be able to see what he sees, right? The level of knowledge that he has is imbued in him, in his experiences. And that knowledge, and how you state what is knowledge, is based on those experiences. And it's something that's really hard to communicate. And so I spent a lot of time not defining things, but opening up conversations for us to understand that these different ways of knowings exist. And you can't define them, and you can't kind of box them into a corner. You can't integrate them sometimes, because they're just different ways of knowing and different ways of experiencing it. And if you try to bring them together, then you're removing all the variables that are important for its creation. So as I was alluding to in the beginning, when I was answering Neil, my journey up until what I did now was very science focused, and learning the methodologies and learning the different ways of understanding our ocean environment, from marine ecology up until natural resource management and mapping and modeling of areas. I spent many, many years scuba diving. I had a job when I was an undergraduate. I was so lucky to be able to scuba dive the west coast of Hawaii Island. It was part of this project called the WAP project, the West Hawaii Aquarium Project, where I got to understand the different variables and species, and kind of almost sadly reflect now on how honored I was, I guess, to be in these spaces when they were abundant. When I dive in these spaces now with my kids, there's nowhere near the abundance that I saw when I was an undergraduate studying in these places. I was lucky enough to go to graduate school on the continent in the University of Washington, and I used ROVs and submersibles to understand invertebrate subtidal communities and map these communities and knowledges. But even on that project, with the Western Fisheries Society, we were including fishermen into the projects and having them help us understand what the habitats are and the conditions are for fisheries. And so I think along the way, I was building up my ability to understand the ocean through embodied experiences of diving and fishing, studying these places, and then going back to the lab and understanding the data behind it and what kind of management decisions will come from it. And those experiences were shaping to me what science is. Yeah, they're shaping to me that we use all of these different methods to come to a single conclusion or to provide recommendations. And in that journey, I was trying to collect the stories of people. And so as I started working on my PhD, and I was understanding the limitations of the models that we're working with, the limitations of the variables that I could collect, I started interviewing people, those uncles that I showed you before, who work with canoes, who fish for their whole lives, who are lifeguards on the beaches. And I started interviewing them along with other community members. And at the same time I was doing that, I found out about a colleague in France, Camille Perrin, who was doing the same thing. She was interviewing sailors that are crossing the Atlantic Ocean, and she was trying to map and model the areas that they access and how they define and categorize the different seascapes that they're traveling as they travel across the Atlantic Ocean in their sailing races. And one of the questions we posed to both our communities was, where does the ocean begin? And here in Hawaii, we got a range of answers, starting from where you put your feet in the ocean, into that little tide pool, that little bit of water along the coastline. Many people answer, the ocean is inside of me. I'm not separate from the ocean. This salt water that flows through me, that comes through my pores, that cries, tears out of my eyes, that's the salt water that I feel in the ocean. So when I go on the ocean, it's just another part of me. Where many of the sailors have that same sort of connection and love for the ocean, but they don't define the ocean as being a part of them. They define the ocean in more of a geographical way of where you can't see land, 200 nautical miles out, right? And what we were trying to get people to do is go beyond the geopolitical boundaries of where the ocean is, go beyond what ecologists say it is. And where do you feel the ocean begins, right? And what we found, and this isn't finished, it's not published yet for sure. She's continued this work in the Caribbean and in different places. But what we see is that the coastal areas and some of these continental spaces are very separate environments from the ocean areas. Where here in Hawaii, we don't separate the coast from the ocean, from the land. It's all included, right? Everything that we see that has to do with the ocean is ocean to us. It's not coastal, it's not mocha, it's not from the land. It's a very ocean space in all of us. And just those differences, what we're proposing is what changes how you manage these spaces, right? Because the meaning that you make of places influences the way you manage these spaces. So if you think the ocean doesn't start until you can't see land, when there's no influence of people and buildings and things like that, you're going to manage that space differently if you understand how the ocean is connected all the way up onto the land, how the ocean goes from underneath our island spaces into the deep sea. And when we talk about ocean, we're bringing in all these different environments together, right? So the epistemology, what do you consider, how we understand the ocean is really different between these cultures. And that's what really started me getting on and thinking about how we manage the ocean is really dependent on the meanings we have behind these different words. And so the words become really important. I became a scientist to really study and enjoy the places around me, to make sure they're thriving and abundant. Yet there started to be, some conflict in that. And that's where I started down this journey of Pono Science. How do I understand how science comes together in an ethical way where I can be a proud scientist, where I can be proud to understand the data that goes in, the things that come out, the meanings of it, the management of it. And so now I want to kind of shift a little bit in the story about my journey up till now and the science that I did and how I'm a scientist and I love being a scientist. But I wanted to be able to bring in these different ways of knowing and not talking about integration of it or braiding of it, but how do we make sure that the science that we're doing is right for the people that I work with, for my people, for Hawaii. And that's where I started learning more about Pono Science. And so the journey I want to share with you today is a little bit about how I've defined this and how I'm using it and practicing it and teaching it, and how I invite you to also join us in this journey. And so definition of Pono is really hard. And I encourage you to go to that link I sent you earlier with the dictionary, and you can look up all these Hawaiian words, but I'm going to walk you through it right now. And so it's a really interesting diagram. It's a symbol that many people talk about of how Hawaii, Hawaii's religion or Hawaii's spirituality is really about the union of humans with the aina, with the land that feeds them, and with our akua, our environmental energies and processes. And when we're all in union, kanaka, humans, the land, and the environmental energies of the deities that exist out there, that creates a space of pono. Okay, so let's walk through that. So the first one I talked about was akua. And I was kind of defining that as an environmental energy. It's a name of any supernatural being. Is this what, if you look it up in the dictionary, Andrew's dictionary definition is kind of the one that we prefer. It talks about its embodiment of natural forces. So our akua aren't gods, that rule over different spaces. Our akua are the environmental energies that make our landscape alive, and we gave them personal names. So for instance, one of the akua that you'll hear a lot about is Kanaloa, the god of the ocean. And I don't like saying he's the god of the ocean. I like saying he is the ocean. So Kanaloa is our ocean. He is the ocean properties that occur because of a confined body of water that's deep, that's subconsciously hard to understand, has all these movements. That is the Akua Kanaloa. That is the oceanic realm. The environmental energies of the ocean are considered Kanaloa. He's always partnered in stories with the Akua Kane. I mean, we used to say that Kane is the god of the sun, but instead of thinking of Kane like being of the sun, think of him as the sun, the heat energy that comes from that orb in the sky. So Kane is that god figure. And we understand how important sunlight and heat is for everything in our environment. And the heat that the sun produces interacting with Kanaloa, the ocean, creates our freshwater cycle. So the trade winds that bring us our nice cool breezes, that bring us our rain that falls in a nice normal pattern, those normal patterns, that's the freshwater. That's Kane Kawaiola. Kane, everything to do with heat and fresh water is Kane. And so these are paired, this Kanaloa and this Kane, because we're not going to have rain without our oceans to create this cycle of water. And without heat evaporating that water, Kane, we wouldn't have fresh water either. And so these akua, these energies, are our environment. And so when you're thinking of that triad and how important the triad was humans, Kanaka, Aina, the land, and Akua, these environmental energies, the embodiment of our natural forces. And so these are just a few of the main Akua that we have. Kane, as I said, is the sun, the heat of the sun. And all the activities that have to do with the heat are related with Kane. Ku, Lono, Kanaloa, Hina, Laka. I don't want you to memorize these, but just to understand when we talk about our Akua, we're not talking about some kind of humanistic figure that is driving what we're doing on land. We're talking a little bit more about how these environmental energies are so important in our landscape that we gave them personal names. So if you think about it in science, we personified these environmental energies. We gave them human names so that we could have a relationship to them. And so when we look out at this Aina, and when we talk about the Trinity and how Aina is one of that Trinity, we're looking at our akuas and we're looking at these spaces that feed us, right? And so our Aina is that second part of that triad. That Aina is that which feeds you. And so this is a total geography concept, and there's many amazing Hawaiian geographers out there who talk about Aina and talk about how the way that humans, that Kanaka Hawaiians, relate to their landscape is that of one of which is in the relationship with, right? Aina is something that feeds us. It's not just the land, it's not just the dirt or the rocks, it's not the physical construct of the island that we're living on. That is the honua. The Aina, which we talk about all the time, is understanding and recognizing that relationship that exists between people and the places that they're living on. And it sort of recognizes the living landscapes, right? So an Aina is sort of a living landscape. And so as an example of that, right? So our living landscapes are these, not just the islands that are pictured, but the oceans in between them. And so the spaces that I'm talking about are Oahu, that's where the University of Hawaii at Mānoa is, and that is where you guys will be coming for the conference. And the land that created me and that raised me was Hawaii Island, Mokuokeawe, here on the bottom corner, and specifically the land of Puna. And in the land of Puna is Pele, and Pele is the volcanic forces. That is the lava that flows out and into the ocean. And if you just think about how different that is, if you think about how living on a land that is constantly changing and evolving and growing, how that changes the way you interact with your spaces. when you think of it as a place that feeds you, when you think of it as a place that is always growing. And so me being from Puna brings this into my epistemology, right? The way I know of the world is different. I take my kids to a beach that's 5 years old, to rocks that have only been here for 5 years. We celebrate their birthdays. We understand that these are living beings just as we are. It makes it kind of a different term for rock, right? When you say rock, when you say mountain, you're kind of erasing the histories behind them, right? But when you give them personal names, that's how humans relate to spaces. So we understand that our aina is important to us, and that's why we gave it lots of personal names. We know our akua, our environmental energies, and the processes around us are super important to us, so we gave them personal names. We're not personifying them as Kanaka, but we're recognizing them with all those individual spaces and names. And so the Kanaka is a third part of that triad, right? And so we're talking about how to have Pono, an area of thriving abundance. We need to have all these different triads be healthy and thriving. Okay, so Akua, Aina, and Kanaka, right? Akua are these elemental properties, these energy, space, entities of the natural world. It is the environment. And Aina is that which feeds the landscape and seascapes that surround you, that feed you sustenance-wise, as well as, mentally and spiritually. So again, that's kind of how I define Pono through those three triads. That's the way our Kapuna have defined it in their writings. And so Pono isn't a balance. It's not just righteousness. Pono is recognizing how all three of these things need to be in abundance, and they're all important. You cannot have a Pono future with just humans being rich. You cannot live on Mars and have Pono, right? It's included in the landscapes that feed you. Kamana Beamer has a really good example and definition of this in some of his writings. And he talks about aloha aina, and you'll hear that word and that phrase all the time. And there's so many different definitions for it. But what I like about this understanding of aloha aina, and again, it's a philosophy, like he's saying, it's a way of knowing, right? Is it's the social, cultural, and ecological examples and components that bring us Pono. So aloha aina to me is another way of talking about Pono, because it understands the social, the cultural, ecological, which is, right, your akua, your aina, and your kanaka all together. And so aloha aina and us embodying aloha aina is Pono, right? That's our search for Pono. And that value for Hawaii was really important, that search for Pono, that understanding. This came to big light on the mountain back in 2015 and again in 2018, when there was a proposal to build a 30-meter telescope on the top of Mauna Kea. Many people came together and talked about how important not building another telescope on the top of the mountain was, right? And they called themselves the protectors of Mauna Kea. And it was a really large event, and it's still ongoing, right? But what this brought to a head to me was that internal dialogue about how do I have a Pono life and do Pono science in a time where science is desecrating those areas that I find super important? How do I, as a scientist, go out there and say, I don't want science to occur? And as I was dealing with this internal dialogue, my really good friends and amazing colleagues, were just as active as I was. And so Kalealoha had this post on Facebook back in 2015, again, in the very first times. And she has a statement here where she's doing that same struggle as I do, like knowing that she has worked for a long time to get more Hawaiians into science. And what she states is, what makes these scientists different is that they know how to contribute to their respective fields without sacrificing that which they hold sacred. Contributing to science without sacrificing what is held sacred. In that one statement, she was able to summarize the dilemma that so many of us were having at the time, saying that I love science, I love being a scientist, and I'm working toward Pono futures. And how do I do that in this space, right? And then her, by capturing this in this quick hashtag Pono Science, pretty much changed the trajectory that I was on and helped me submit my place and my narrative and where we're going from there. And I see that in people like my children. So this is a picture of my daughter. She's much taller and bigger now, but she doesn't see that dilemma. She was raised at an immersion school, fighting for her Mauna. Here she is at the rally beside me, flying her Hawaiian flag very proudly. And yet when she was asked last year what she was going to college for and her dream for in 10 years, she said she wanted to be an astronomer. My daughter doesn't see the differences of these worlds. She sees how she can do what she wants in a Pono space going into the future, right? Because this is the landscape that she is around. So what is this Pono Science? How does she, even though she's a super active, was at all the protests proudly, understand that she can still be an astronomer? It's because in her mind, she will do science Pono. She will do it ethically. She will understand aloha aina and how that is what our people are doing. And she will understand that this is a way of doing science in the world that we can all do. When I try to really learn more about what Pono is and how do I bring this into my science, but also in the science that I teach my students, I started on this journey of trying to learn more about what Pono was. And Kumu John Kaimikawa, he was an amazing kumu from the island of Molokai. He shared a lot of the old ways and ways of thinking with us, right? And he has this quote, that the love and respect that is achieved between humans and the environment when all is flourishing is Pono, right? So we have Kanaka, we have Aina, and we have Akua. When everything is flourishing, that's Pono. Right. And these are, it's hard to find visuals for Pono. And I always have to throw my kids under the bus. But these are pictures that I have of my kids where I'm like, my son here on the top is in a bed of a kuli grass on the barren Ka'u coastline that's all lava fields. Yet this akuli is flowering, it's thriving on this coastal landscape. And my son saw this, recognized its amazing health and abundance, and just enjoyed it. He tasted of it. He plucked those little succulent leaves and wanted to understand if it was salty or fresh water. My daughter here is on the top of Pu'uhuluhulu. We did a hike and she is just, being present in these spaces, right? That's what we want. And so how do we do that in our science? How do we make sure that this Pono that we're searching for is part of our science? And so that's the quest I'm on right now. And as Neil said, I became a scientist and I came to the cultural side of things, but I'm still doing science, right? And I'm recognizing all the ancient wisdom that's in my kupuna, my ancestral science, but also recognizing that there's many, many different people doing science in Hawaii. And how do I support them in ways that they can do science that's good for Hawaii and good for science itself and move it forward? And so I'm trying to redefine Pono in the light of science. And I see this sort of as a three-step process of one is your intention, the action of doing good, right? So if you want to do science, it starts with the very questions you're asking. Who's involved in answering those questions? Where are you? How are you going to do it, right? Just that whole intention. And we talk about the same thing when we talk to our students about why are you doing research projects? That's not a part of your IRB. Right? In your IRB, you don't have to talk about your intention. You don't have to talk about who's involved in asking these questions. And that's what makes Pono science different than just ethical science. So let's try and move beyond ethics here. The second part of Pono research is looking and searching for good conduct. So how are you actually completing your science? Are you trying to give no harm to others? Are you bringing along the next generation with you? That's something I always say, is that we have to build our networks, right? Our relationships with our pilina. So are you having good relationships with everyone in your lab? Are you having good relationships with the people and the places that you're working in, right? That good conduct while you're doing it. And then the state of wellness achieved. And so what are you doing the science for? is it helping us become a more healthy, thriving, and abundant place of Hawaii? So Pono is intention, it's an action, and it's something that can be achieved at the end, right? So that is like sort of the process of Pono. And so when we talk about a Pono paradigm, when I'm starting to talk about Pono science or Pono research or any ways that you're talking about Pono, it is something that's way beyond ethics, right? It encourages us to understand our power as researchers, that intention, right? Understanding that even if your research does harm no one, it doesn't mean you're still not showing your positionality within these places, right? So your epistemic relationships, how you are interacting in these spaces is defined by how you think of this landscape. The reason I shared a lot about what Aina was and Akua was for you, because that is our epistemic relationship with the place that we call Hawaii. It's not just a story or a metaphor that we think the landscape is alive. It's not just a way that we talk about Hawaii and talk about Mauna Kea as this large, important future on our landscape as our grandfather. When you think of your landscapes as living, that's a different relationship when you do research, right? So when you go and doing a Pono paradigm, you have to understand the relationship you have with spaces, change the relationships and the research that you do with it, right? And that influences all the frameworks. So this 3 kind of step Pono paradigm is kind of trying to show, okay, you go beyond your ethical ways of knowing and understanding that everything you do as a scientist, everything you do as a researcher will influence the frameworks that you're working in, right? And they're also influenced by the frameworks that you brought to the table, right? So a Pono paradigm is making sure that at the center of all our research is this understanding that we're doing things for the life, health, and abundance of Aina, Akua, and Kanaka, that you can't separate those from what Pono is and from what research is. I like to bring in the work of Robin Wall Kimmerer. She does some amazing writings. And she has one quote from her book, Braiding Sweetgrass, that states, "Being naturalized to place means to live as if this is the land that feeds you, as if these are the streams from which you drink, that build your body and fill your spirit. To know that your ancestors lie in this ground, to live as if your children's futures matter, to take care of the land as if our lives and the lives of all our relatives depend on it, because they do." Right? So this is me showing you that Pono science is relevant everywhere. Here she's talking about to live as if this is the land that feeds you, right? Your Aina, that lands that feed you. If we do science in places around the world, but act like we're trying to naturalize them, act like we have a relationship to them, right? That we're dependent on them. That's going to change the way you do your research. It's going to change the way you understand these spaces. And that's important because it changes the framework of which we do science. And that to me is the most important reason to do these. I love science. I hope we all love science and doing research, but I want to make sure that we're doing science for the right reasons. It has to feed not just humans, but the landscapes and the environments that we do our research in. My work in this Pono science field encouraged me to write one credit class, just a quick seminar, and I call it Pono Science. And in this seminar, I help students, it's a graduate class, explore Hawaiian ethics, implications of research, and decolonizing methodology. And the reason I think this class is so important and why the students really have a welcoming space to have the discussions is because we have these larger conversations always happening around us, right? And we know that we are an amazing research institute at the University of Hawaii, and we encourage researchers to come and scholars to come and stay in our spaces. We want to make sure that we're creating safe spaces for our people to also be in communion with them, and that the research that people do supports our communities and the thriving of our communities going forward, right? And so the graduate students I have are amazing. They come from all different disciplines across the university, and they're all trying to do Pono science. They all come with the right intention and are open to having these dialogues. Some of them come with internal conflicts already. It's like, can I do science here? What is my place here? I have Hawaiian scientists who come to that space that are dealing with those same sort of complications that I had when I was younger about, am I a good scientist? Like, how do I do science here that serves my people? How do I make sure that, I'm not turning into something that doesn't represent my people? And so I have kind of a 3-step process: the hua, the flowering stage, the mu'o, where you're budding and you're opening, and you're lala to branch out. So this is sort of my continuum of how we learn about these discussions through a Hawaiian way of knowing. So I don't follow sort of any ethics protocols. I don't really follow any of that curriculum. It's based upon our way of blossoming the way we think about the world. So in the first stage, we create trust and we build relationships. And as I said, these graduate students are coming from many, many different departments and many different backgrounds. Most people who go through science, like I did with the marine science, environmental science degrees, never hear the word epistemology. We don't understand that methodologies are different than methods. We think methodologies is quantitative or qualitative. So we build beyond that. We start understanding the relationships of where we are. We start understanding ethics, data sovereignty. And we start with just a little bit of foundation in Hawaiian science and indigenous epistemologies and research methodologies. And it's always amazing to me about how things that social scientists probably spend a lot of time understanding isn't even introduced into the physical sciences, into the environmental sciences at all, until perhaps, as I do, in graduate school, right? So we create that foundation of the way that you see and interact with the land influences the research that you do. And then we build on that and understand what these different ways of knowing are, the different knowledge systems. What does it mean to have sacred in science? Auntie Kekuhi, Keali'i Kanakaʻoleo Hailelani has some great papers on talking about the sacred in science and indigenous data. We have lots of scholars coming out with that information. So I introduce this type of work to my grad students. We talk about and the broader ideas of indigenous people in science and how we decolonize these spaces and how we all have a role, the kuleana, that relationality, our positions in being part of this process. And in the third part of the class, we open it up and each of the student groups come up with case studies of how they are struggling or celebrating or understanding what Pono Science means to them as they go on into their journeys. And so I just have on the screen some of the different examples of topics that they've talked about through their time or over the last couple of years as I've taught this class. Some students talk about outreach and education in local versus indigenous communities. How does that change the conversations? How does that change the methods? What does it mean to do quantitative indigenous methodology, right? We always assume things are qualitative, but what is a quantitative indigenous methodology? What is the role of language in research? And that might be a question social scientists ask, but what's the difference if a political ecologist or a seascape ecologist ask that same question? What if you look at the reef using different languages? How does that change the research that you do, right? So just opening up that space and giving students the ability to talk about these things together. So in Pono Science, we do exactly what Robin Wall Kimura says, and we try to be someone working on the side of the people and the earth. We try to expand that definition of what a scientist is and what a scientist can be. And make Hawaiians be proud to be scientists, make all of us proud to be scientists, even though sometimes it can be a scary word where we think of scientists as bad sometimes. We're trying to reclaim and re-understand those words. And to do that is part of it is decolonizing ourselves, right? Really changing the ways that we approach things and understanding what decolonization in science means. And I just grabbed this quick Instagram post about decolonizing skills for non-Hawaiians. It's just one of those conversations that we have to, and if you haven't heard about decolonization, right? We just have these conversations with the students and what it means for decolonization within the research that we do, within the science that we do. And one of the basic parts of that is just understanding that the science we do is never objective, right? It's a subjective process. And the positionality that you have within the research is something that you have to be cognizant of. And so our conversations around decolonization aren't in any ways minimizing any of the work that we do. It's just framing the conversations differently. So as I wrap up now, I just want to talk a little bit about what some of those examples that we bring to the table of like, how do we do decolonized science and research and take it out of the philosophical components? Like I said, I'm not a philosopher. I really don't know how to to talk about those things with big words, but I know what it looks like on the ground, right? And I use these examples for my students to really kind of open their minds about what can their research do and how can they frame it, because most of them are coming out of labs, right, where their faculty might not be interested in these things, might not have these frameworks or ways of knowing, and so they're not getting that guidance all the time of what it means to do research that's important to them and important to Hawaii in a decolonizing fashion. So here's one of those spaces. If you've been to Hilo, if you've been to Keaukaha, then you've been to the end of the road here at Waiuli, also known as Richardson's Ocean Beach Park. And what I see here, what you see here might be just, oh, looks like the tide's kind of high. You know, it's kind of overflowed the banks. You can see how the grass is under the water. But what I really want to show is that little sign there that says Fish Pond Restoration. Keep calm in the local i'a. Right? And so these colleagues, these friends of mine, these amazing Kanaka decided to restore this fish pond. They came with many different skills, many different talents, but what they came with was the right intention. They didn't need permission. They didn't need someone to tell them to do that. They didn't need the job that someone's paying them to do this. They just needed to know that this is the place that fed them all their lives, and they wanted it to be thriving and healthy again. They wanted to be able to eat from these spaces. And so they just started doing it. And they just started working really hard. And it's amazing to see where they've come so far now, where they host hundreds of student groups, where they teach people from college ages, from people from the continent, people from around the world, how to take care of their spaces. And they did that just because they wanted to, just because they lived there. And now they're getting paid for it, right? But that decolonizing movement to me was really grounded in the space of intention and them knowing that this space that they have lived in all their lives needed their attention, their love, their relationship, and they started restoring it. Another decolonizing event I'd like to talk about is this ceremony, the Pua'ana'ana ceremony. And it was started back in the very beginning of the spread of the rapid ohia death. And you can see that little website there at the bottom. I think that website's still active. And this is a fungal disease that's affecting our ohia trees, one of the most abundant and important tree species that we have in Hawaii. And as we were learning how scary and how threatening this fungus disease was to our plants, it really affected our cultural practices, right? So we use this ohia plant to make lei, to make ceremonial garb. We use it especially in hula, and in particularly with this one, with the Merry Monarch. So Merry Monarch is coming, right? It's going to be here in Hilo in a couple weeks. And what they were doing is trying to create this space to say that, okay, we want you to continue your cultural practice, but yet we recognize that there is also this really bad ecological problem that's starting and it's going to get worse. And so this process was led through a partnership with Kekuhi and Christian Giardina and all the different forestry faculty, research faculty. And they came together and they created this space for this ceremony where all the ohia products that were used in the hula process, or for anyone who used it as a lei to wear, just to celebrate, could dispose of it properly without taking and spreading that fungus any further, right? And the way I love to see this process is because it's not just telling you to stop, right? Not just telling people, do not pick, do not gather, do not enter. Instead, they're creating a space of welcoming and being like, we understand that this is a problem, and we're gonna decolonize our approach by creating a new ceremony. This ceremony might not have existed in this fashion before because it didn't have a purpose, but now this ceremony has a purpose, and this is the fires of Hi'iaka. This is the fire of rebirth and creating new spaces. And a lot of the programming, the language, the education that came out around this was also in that fashion. Because what scientists had been calling rapid ohia death, or ROD is scary, ROD is bad. You're just putting those energies out in the world, right? About stop and bad. And instead, we want life. We want history. We want to understand that ohia is going forward. So we called it the Kuko'i'aolaka. We want to understand the deity that makes a healthy forest. And we're going to say his name over and over again. We're going to exercise our recognition of who Hi'iaka is and how important she is, that's what we're going to put our focus on, while we do the science behind preventing the spread of this fungal disease, right? So that just reframing and restoration of the process. Another example that I like to bring up is one of Kamakakūokalani. So Kamakakūokalani was a palawa, was a whale that washed ashore on Oahu. Oh, wow. Many, many years ago already. Forget how long ago this happened. And so in any type, there's federal marine protection laws, right? That no one can approach whales or dolphins. They're protected. And so when these species come ashore, NOAA goes into full force to making sure they protect this species and that no one interacts with it, right? You can't, it's against the law to possess any of their bones or any of their body parts. But yet this whale came ashore in Waikiki, in Honolulu Harbor, Sand Island, kept coming back to shore. And so NOAA's first response is to move it offshore to make sure it stays away from humans. But there's a group called Kia'i, led by Roxanne and Kealoha Pishoda, and they recognize our traditional relationships with Kanaloa, and Kanaloa being these large species that are the bodily forms of Kanaloa, the ocean. And so Palawa is one of these special creatures. And this creature, this Kamakakūokalani, came ashore 3 times. By the time he came ashore the 3rd time, they're like, he does not want to be towed out to sea. He does not want, he is asking to decompose, to go to pole, to return to the life after death on this beach in Hawaii. He wants to be here in Hawaii. He doesn't want to be an oceanic landfall whale. And that relationship, that Kia'i Kanaloa, this hui of practitioners who are trying to understand traditional relationships with palawa and ocean species, tries to work alongside with NOAA to fight for our cultural ways of knowing, which isn't recognized by the federal government because we're not a recognized peoples in federal legislation. And so we fought to do Hawaiian science alongside their Western sciences. So if you think about that dichotomy about the Marine Mammal Protection Act, no one can access it, no one can interact with it, no one can harvest it, but yet there are certain scientists who have all the access they want to that whale, right? They can take as many samples as they can take all their bones back to their scientific facilities, they can check the DNA, they can dissect it, they can do all this work on it, but a Hawaiian scientist can't touch them, all right? And so NOAA tried to create the space and let us do some Hawaiian science. And so this was my attempt at being there. And so what does it mean to be a Hawaiian scientist studying such a, how do you call that? Such an important species as a palawa, right? Most of our science is about relationality. It's about creating spaces. It's about having intention and working together with this species. And so being present is like one of the biggest methods that you can do to do Indigenous science, right? Being present, observing, understanding the relationships, who's coming, who's visiting, what impact is it having on its environment? What process is it going as it decomposes? If I want to read an old story of Kanaloa, if I read an old oli that my ancestors wrote about an ocean whale, how will I make any sense of that if I've never had an interaction with an ocean whale? If I've never been there and see him decompose, how will I know when they talk about that process in the oli, right? You have to live these experiences to be able to decipher them in the olis. So I took my students with us and we tried to be there, to be present, to take our observations, to name him, right? To be a part of these processes. And that to me is just as important as all the samples that you might take in the world, right? And we all know we learn the most when we build a palina relationship and we have these one-on-one conversations, this one-on-one time when you're just embedded in space. And so creating space for different types of science research, creating space for Hawaiian scientists to be present in these spaces is important. The last example I'm going to use is more of a management one, and it just focuses on limu. And when you come to Hawaii, eat limu. Limu is amazing. It's one of the really important parts of our Hawaiian diet. And it's in decline everywhere. And our communities across Hawaii are all trying to revive this practice of limu and eating limu and how do we preserve it? And you talk to the scientists who've been studying limu for a long time, including our most amazing scientist, Auntie Izzy Abbott, and they can tell you a lot about its phylogeny. They can talk a lot about its ecology. They can tell you about where it grows and all these things, but no one can tell you how to measure its abundance, because it's such an interesting species that grows in so many different ways and so many different habitats, and patchy and this, and it's called different things in different places. But all these communities, and I just listed a couple communities here that I've been working with recently, just want to make sure that limu is healthy. And so they come to the scientists and say, tell us it's healthy. And it's hard to survey limu. It's really hard to understand it. So we've been bringing together cultural practitioners and scientists and students all together to understand, how do we make sense of our limu? How do we create methods that are community-based, perhaps biocultural, indigenous, just methods that allow us to understand if the species that we're trying to eat is abundant or not, right? Those basic ecological questions that you think from science. But this space is really complicated. We've been working on this for about 4 or 5 years. There's the Limu Hui group that's amazing, that's getting people connected to their limu, and they have that knowledge, right? They can look at their reef and they understand if it's healthy or not. But how do they transfer that knowledge, that relationship they have with their space, to a different space, to a different community, to understand if theirs is healthy, right? Those are the conversations that we're trying to have. Really trying to reframe how we do science that serves our communities. And then my last example of reframing is based on the Pono. And you'll see a lot of things similar to that, right? This Pono phrase is a really big catchword. And I want to caution people about using the word Pono. And that's when I talk about Pono Science, there's not one definition for it. That I have a whole class for us to just sort of sit with it and figure it out together, but we never understand it. We never finish it, right? But it's all about this understanding of the dialogue. And so we have a problem of a less abundance of fish in Hawaii. I don't like to call it overfishing. I think our oceans are unhealthy for many different reasons, and I wouldn't want to blame just the fishermen. So when they try to talk about the Pono, fishing Pono, they're trying to reframe that dialogue about not just saying stop this or blame them, but how do we do things in a Pono fashion? How do we understand that we need to continue fishing? This little boy here needs to know what an ʻŌiwi is. He needs to be able to scale it and eat it and catch it. He needs to go out there to keep his traditional relationships alive, right? We need fishing to continue, but we need to make sure that the fish, the kanaka, the environment, all of that is in Pono relations. And so that's where I come with my final word I'm going to throw at you is restoration, right? And this is another word by Robin Wall Kimmerer that I love, about changing the narrative, about not going back to an ancient time, but the stories that we're saying, the restoration of the landscape is us restoring our landscapes, telling stories that are about the present and how we're going to move forward. Talking about how science is something that we all love and that we're all going to continue to do, that we need to do it, but we want to do it in a Pono fashion, right? Not protesting against, but protecting our futures. And so those are the stories that I have with my students, really trying to understand that we're all here with the same intention for a Pono fashion. I want to make sure that they're healthy, their ainas are healthy, their communities are healthy, and that they use the methods that help them to get them there. Really understanding that our ainas need us, they need good scientists, and our communities need us. So I'll leave you with one last quote from another colleague of mine, Kamakakūokalani. And he had an amazing blog post, and here's a link to a bunch of his different podcasts that he has. And in his little story that he wrote, he ends it that we live in the future. Come join us, right? Alluding to the fact that we are Hawaii. We're not protesting the future. We're not trying to stop progress. We're not saying that the ancient ways were better. We were saying our ancient ways are what's going to feed us moving forward. And I leave you with this picture, again, of my children. Many, many years ago, when they were little and didn't talk back yet, and they see their future in this traditional sailing canoe, right? This sailing canoe is equipped with radars, sonar, it has a solar system so that they have a microwave, and yet they sailed in their traditional pattern, right? My children's future isn't split. It's not a dichotomy of their ancient kupuna and their future selves. They are living this future internally, easily, right? There's no split before them. And that's the future that we all want to live in, a Pono future, where we use our innovations and mostly our values from our ancestors to live in a Pono fashion and to do the work that we do going forward. So thank you. And I know there's a few questions in the chat, and I'll probably stop sharing screen here so that we can maybe have that dialogue together. And then I'll try and get to your questions as well.
Awesome. That was brilliant. That was brilliant. It's real. You made a challenging topic very, very accessible, and with a lot of passion and personal story. I think you did an excellent job, and I'm really happy that so many were able to join today. And I hope that many will be tuning into this and watching the tape version as they prepare for the conference. So mahalo nui, Noelani. That was awesome. I'll help you with those questions that came in, and maybe some more will come in as we speak. From an anonymous attendee, I'm writing a paper on the ongoing City and County of Honolulu versus Sunoco LP case, and during research read a paper that referred to aina in terms of kua aina, hoa aina, and the interrelated values of aloha aina, malama aina, and kia'i aina. The article argued that indigenous agency is embedded in local Hawaiian governance. Could you elaborate for those of us who are not informed on the different dimensions of aina? Oh, a lot to unpack there.
A lot. I'll start off saying those first couple words that you add, the kua aina and the hoa aina, and then actually those two terms talk about relationships to aina, right? So we have lots of different words to talk about a relationship to our aina. And those are traditional words that our kupuna used to kind of define almost like what rank or what status you had with the aina. And so those are sort of interchangeable, and different people have different kuleana who write about it. I know Mehana Vaughn writes a lot, I think, about the kua aina and hoa aina terms, and I encourage you to read some of her papers. I myself like to talk about aloha aina, malama aina, and kia'i aina a lot. I also talk about ho'ipo'ipo aina, if I want to throw another one in there. And I use an example, and again, there's many different ways that people use these words, but I like to use an example about, I was trained in malama aina. I was trained in how to caretake, how to steward, how to help protect the aina that feeds me. And that was sort of my science side. And then I came to Hawaiian Studies, and I work with students who aloha aina, who have that deep affiliation and connection and reciprocity that exists with aloha. Because aloha is not a one way. Aloha is aloha he alo, face to face, that exchange that you have with your aina. So it's a practice that you do. So many of us are trained in science, and I say you're trained in malama aina. But the only people who are going to make a difference are the ones who aloha aina, the ones who bring their love to their work and their passion. And we all know that the people who make the most difference in this world are the ones that are most passionate and most connected to their places, right? Those are the people that are going to make changes. Kia'i aina is another level. Those are our guardians, our stewards. They're the ones that are protecting and creating those boundaries for the aloha aina to occur. They're the ones who are fighting and putting in that time to do it. I like to take it up to another level of ho'ipo'ipo aina, where you actually are creating love with a space. And Kahikina de Silva has amazing writings where she talks about, and other scholars as well, Hawaiians didn't know how to love without loving aina. We talk, all the metaphors that we have about love are metaphors of the landscape, of birds, of plants, of water, of rain. Like, it's all metaphorical. And it just shows you that Hawaiians know love through aina. And so that's just another way to show that everything is just so interrelated in the Hawaiian ways of knowing, that nothing is objective. There's no way to separate Hawaiians from their aina and from their landscape. So that aloha of aina, that malama of aina is all interrelated. So I know there's 1,000 other answers to that question, but that'll be my quick one.
I think if the conferees want to explore that relationship, just listen to music, right? The music of Hawaii, when you go through the airport, you'll hear the strains of many songs. You can go to the stores and look at CDs and buy CDs or stream Hawaiian music on right now while you're, no matter where you are in the world, on Spotify or Pandora or something, stream and listen to the words and feel the love that people have for place, for their aina, through music. Another, Mehana, Kamana Beamer, excellent authors on the topics of Aina, and also Daviana McGregor. We can't forget Davy and her body of work as well. Another question: could you please talk a little bit more about decolonization versus anti-colonization?
Yeah, we talk about a lot of these terms in the class that I do. And I think there is a movement for people to talk more about anti-colonization. With the students I go on, because they're mostly from the natural sciences field, I get oceanographers, I get geologists, I get people studying planetary biology. We don't get stuck in the weeds about the definitions, but the actions that you're doing personally to move things forward. And so when we talk about anti-colonization, it's your positionality in the research that you do. It's the way you approach your research. It's the way you write about it. And to me, those are more important than just the philosophy of things. And that's just because I am not from that. And I know I'm not skilled in talking and using those big theoretical words, but I'm more in the practice. How are we serving our communities? And how is the work that you're doing serving the communities? And if the people I work with have the community, both the landscape and the people, communities intertwined as their focus, that's what I care about. So sorry to kind of push it aside, but there's lots of different examples. And I think that's why the examples are where you go. Like, how are the actions that you're doing showcasing this and creating space for the sovereignty of Hawaii, right? I think both of those terms are also saying that Hawaii cannot be thriving if our people aren't thriving. And so we need our sovereignty to do that. But sovereignty doesn't have to be political. Sovereignty can be, how do you say it? Like in your mind, right? You can decolonize your mind. You can just be part of this landscape and work for Hawaii. It doesn't matter what government's in charge. So I don't like the government structure stop us from doing the work that we need to do.
Yeah, it's interesting. We've just done a bit of study on the concept of ea, and recognizing that only in more recent times it became more of a political concept. Before, it was really about internal, and that sense of self and understanding and liberating oneself. So it's speaks to your point. Another question: love this science, which focuses on flourishing futures, and it resonates with Indigenous science in Australia. But there is a growing movement in human geography, cultural geography, that focuses on an era of negativity, bad feeling, the abyss in ocean studies. What does Pono Science say about negativity, bad feelings, etc.? And I think you addressed that a little bit at the end when you're talking about fishing and some of your practices, but respond to that, please.
Yeah, I think if you use the Hawaiian dictionary, and what I found is if you look into these things, Hawaii doesn't have a lot of bad words. Like people always ask, oh, how do you swear in Hawaiian?
Like
It's
there's
all
no
about
word for enemy, right? There's no word for enemy,
no,
right?
nope, there's no word for evil. We don't have those types of ways of knowing in our epistemology, in our way of knowing in Hawaii. And so that's something I brought into the science. Like we don't have a need for that. You don't have a word for it because you don't have a need for that. And that's why I think we do focus on the futures. Like our people are still here, we're thriving, and we're going to live in the future. And so focusing on negativity doesn't really help us move forward, I think. And you see a little bit about that when you talk about Kanaloa, the ocean deity, the ocean akua, is that they didn't have a way of describing him in the past. And so the missionaries tried to say that he was bad or he was different, but it's just because we didn't have a way of using those words. We didn't have that conflict of bad and evil that there are in so many other cultures. And so I don't see how that helps us move forward by doing that. And if you want to learn a little bit more about that, we do have some different webinars that colleagues and I have done about climate change. There's one called about how do you receive Kane and Kanaloa, and we talk about how most of the people that I know that are working in climate science that are Hawaiian scientists, we're not people that are looking at the negative side of things either. We talk about how our people are going to thrive into the future, and all of our work is looking at the harsh realities that is happening, but the narrative that we use talk about our futures and how our futures are going to be thriving futures, how we're going to help our communities get stronger in the face of climate change. So we're always trying to change that narrative to talk in that sort of positivist feel.
Yeah, and I know that's interrelated with the colonization issue because as we've kind of looked upon and thought a lot about the losses and the grievances of colonization, it kind of brought us to that negative mindset of of grievance. And a lot of the work, as we've kind of revived a lot of cultural practice and so forth, has really been pushing us. I remember a Maori friend, colleague, a very esteemed man from South Island of New Zealand, said when they settled their claim with the crown, said for 8 generations we were defining ourselves by grievance. It was time to really have a vision of what we could be in the future, and no amount of settlement was going to be enough for the losses of life, for the losses of land, for the losses of resource and sovereignty, but they had to make the mind shift. They had to become native again by seeing themselves in that positive light, and led to their settlement and a whole new movement and progress for their people. Okay, another question: how do you go about internal conflicts? You mentioned. Can I do this kind of science? Can I do this kind of science? How do I make sure I can do science here as a non-native researcher from a different country working on indigenous land? So obviously this is a large part of the audience of this webinar and of attendees at the conference. They may be non-native and not indigenous to the place where they're doing research. And I think you've kind of given a little roadmap for that and for them. But why don't you kind of highlight that again for us?
Yeah, those are definitely the hard questions that we all struggle with. I mean, we struggle with as Hawaiians. How do we do science here in Hawaii? So one thing at my class that I really like is that I have students from all different backgrounds having these questions together and having this dialogue together, because there's not a simple answer, right? And we all bring our different experiences to that together. And I have people in the class that are actually like federal employees talking with students. So they get the philosophical part, but they actually get the applied part. Like, okay, this is my job now. And how am I doing my job? How am I doing fishery scientists here in Hawaii? And a lot of the answer just comes down to dialogue. Hawaii love to talk before our kuka kuka. We alo ahe alo, like it's all about conversations and relationality. And you'll see how important relationships are to us in Hawaii with our places, with each other. That aloha spirit comes out because to me, that is the only way to figure it out. Like you can't do it by yourself. It's not a method that you do. It's not a paper that you write. It is in the relationships that you build with each other and with the communities. And like I mentioned, I think if you're working for the communities and with the communities, that's always how you know, because you're with them, you're understanding them, and they're able to tell you, kind of put you in line if they need to, or also support you in that growth. So there's a bit about coming to the table, doing your homework, right? Not expecting that everyone is going to teach you and everyone is going to take your hand and lead you through it and applaud you along the way. It takes a lot of your own growth. It takes a lot about doing your own homework. One of the biggest steps I always encourage people to do is to volunteer, to get out there in that community and put your hands in the ground with them, learn about it from that hands level, from that ground level, and just being there in their spaces with them.
In that vein, the conference will have a few organized land engagements. And so conferees are encouraged to really take advantage of those opportunities to get out onto the land, to meet people, to see places. But most of them will be going to the Hilton Hawaiian Village and the Convention Center in Honolulu, in a very urban state. What can they do to really kind of see beyond the built environment of high rises and hotels and all the concrete and asphalt to the Hawaii that's there, right? Even in Waikiki, even in Honolulu, what can they look for to really understand the Hawaii that we know, that's in that backdrop behind you so beautifully depicted, so that they don't just kind of be upon our land, but be here in our land?
Yeah, being a part of nature to me is the best place to understand Hawaii. To spend your time outdoors, to spend your time talking to people, interacting with people. It is a hard question. And I think there's a lot of conversations about how extractive conferences can be. I just came from one in New Orleans and I said the same thing, like, okay, I know we're trying to welcome people here. How do I make myself a guest in New Orleans? You know, what do I do here to make that? And I liked eating of their food. Where you put your money is a big thing, right? Knowing who are you supporting with the food that you're eating, with the places that you're attempting to go to, with your impact on the land. Really trying to make those relationships or those interactions as healthy as you can be with them. Like go outside and feel our ocean, feel our sand, you know, take a hike, go and see what our forests are like. I mean, we have beautiful spaces, even in the downtown areas. There's lots of mo'olelo, there's lots of stories. In the international marketplace, I think they have a beautiful spaces. They have Hawaiian language music flowing throughout it. I think those supporting our musicians is a big one. They're there. Yeah, I know, I'm sure you have other things, Neil.
Oh, many of the venues in Royal Hawaiian Center, International Marketplace, these are both venues in Waikiki for the benefit of our conferees, as well as outriggers, little walk. So cruise a little bit along Waikiki, and I'm sure within the Hilton Hawaiian Village, they also have some Hawaiian entertainment and other things that really promote education and awareness of Hawaii. Another question has come in. What do you think of Maori people's success in advocating for legal personhood of Wanganui River in 2018, this first landscape to ever receive personhood protections? Do you think the U.S. settler state will ever be able to embrace indigenous epistemologies and the living state of land in its environmental laws and regulations at a national scale? Big question.
That's a big question. And I'll probably leave most of that to our Indigenous legal experts. But I think in my simple response, and you get to it, I think, at the end of your question about embracing the epistemologies behind the land being living. And I think that goes back to what Neil was talking about, Ea. And I'm not a politician, I'm not a legal expert, but I know what I love and I know how to treat those people that I love or those places that I love. So it doesn't need to have an environmental law in place for us to protect Mauna Kea, right? We can still do that through the love that we have. I do hope that our nation will get to the space where they understand the value and importance, but those are just really different epistemologies that are like present on the national scale, right? This is why I talk a little bit about, not that I don't support, but I don't always talk about braiding epistemologies or integrating of epistemologies, because if one person thinks they're related to the landscape, that's a really different understanding for someone who doesn't think the land is alive. You can't integrate those ways of knowing. You can't integrate that idea that this landscape is part of my genealogy and someone else saying, well, it just came out of the ground and it exists. Like those things can't be mixed. And so you have to recognize that in good ways, to know that that's not the conflict, right? The conflict is just that we have different ways of being and going in the world. And these landscapes are alive to some people and they're alive to me. Yeah, and just trying to move forward without the laws in place. But I'm glad for the people who do get the laws. I think Hawaii right now is a part of the United States political arena, which is a little harder.
And yet we have our own state constitutional protections and reservations of some of the traditional rights. And for those members of this webinar, participants in this webinar or attendees at the conference, who are interested in this topic, they should go to the University of Hawaii Richardson School of Law Kahuliao program, which is the Native Hawaiian law program of our local law school. And they've done a lot of interesting primers and other published material on the issues of Hawaiian rights. And we don't necessarily speak of it in terms of the resource or the land having rights so much as Native peoples having rights to continue practices, which then perpetuated that relationship that you've talked about so well in your presentation today. So
yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, the Native Hawaiian Law Center has done some really good stuff. And Hawaii is one of the few states in the United States that recognizes our people's right to a healthy environment. And we have that basis because of our kingdom law is still in effect in the state constitution. So we're very lucky for that.
And commend the Kamakakūokalani Center for Hawaiian Studies. If people check that website out and go to that links, you'll find a number of authors and a number of brilliant faculty there, your colleagues, Noelani, who've written on it. And it's part of the larger school of Hawaii Nui Akea School of Hawaiian Knowledge, which is also got many brilliant people, many of whom I expect will be at the seminar or the conference. So I don't see any more questions. Any final thoughts you have for these 5,000 to 6,000 conferees who are becoming to Hawaii, these geographers from around the nation and in some cases around the world to Hawaii? Closing thought for them?
Closing thoughts. I think of Hawaii is somewhere special. Almost everyone around the world has heard of Hawaii. And I think it's a privilege to come. As I've traveled the world, I've realized how special Hawaii is, how unique we are. And I'm proud of that going forward. And I hope when you come to Hawaii, you're able to really see the true Hawaii, understand the values that are beneath it, understand the culture that has allowed it to become such a unique place in the world. And also in its geographies, right? Its seascapes, its landscapes, and how they've changed the way we look at the world, and encourage you to take those ways of knowing of the world back to the places that you're from as well, because I think they are universal in so many ways. Just lucky that we had such an amazing, beautiful place to be raised in, that our culture was developed in, but we love to share that with the world.
Yeah. Indeed, mahalo ke akua. And mahalo to you, Noelani, for just a brilliant presentation. We thank you for taking the time to share that with the American Association of Geographers, and I'm sure many will be checking out your publications and your work online to learn more and continue their studies. So with that, we'll bid adieu to our attendees. Thank you for participating today, whether you're doing it live or you're doing a tape version. We hope you've gained something from our presentation. We hope you'll tune in to some of the past webinars we've had, as well as a couple more that we have lined up before the conference occurs in April. So with that, aloha no.
There we go.